Wonderful. Our next speaker is Julian Anderson. Julian Anderson has served as head of composition at the Royal College of Music, as Fannie P. Mason Professor of Music at Harvard University, and is currently Professor of Composition and Composer in Residence at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. His list of performances and commissions is very long, but includes works for the Berlin Philharmonic, Cleveland Orchestra, London Symphony Orchestra, Asko-Schoenberg Ensemble, Ensemble Intercontemporain, Arditi and Jacques Quartets, and many others. His talk today deals with the topic of spectral centrality.
Thank you very much, Robert Hasegawa. If anyone wants to have the full information, because this has to be very precise, they can contact me. I have the full paper elsewhere. So very briefly, my experience in spectral thinking goes back a very long way. I wrote my first spectral piece in 1984 when I was 17. It's a string quartet, and I would like to play the opening of that, which was premiered only in 2013, 29 years later. As you can see, there's much use of overbowing, and the basic spectrum from which it starts is a bowed metal plate, so it's a classic inharmonic spectrum, which is then distorted by means of overbowing, and some indifference tone progressions are taken. Also, the harmonics of suppont are picked up. The overbowing is picked up as well to generate new pitches, and gradually, therefore, there is a harmonic transition. So I was working very much with inharmonic spectra mainly at that time, or some swinging to harmonic spectra sometimes as well. But I began to feel that with inharmonic spectra there was a perceptive problem. I'd been studying very much and still interested in the psychoacoustic research of that period here by Al Bregman, Steve McAdams, and Dave Wessel and people like that. And I became very concerned about the notion of what the listener perceives in terms of any kind of logical progression from one sound event to another or from one area to another. Of course, in minimalist music, this is solved by means of processes, and also in early spectral music to some extent. But if you are having progressions which are determined, let us say, by chains of sum and difference tones, then you are often at risk of being in the same situation John Cage is in when he is deriving progressions or pitches from perforations in the sound of in the music paper. It may produce interesting results, but there's no necessarily reason that the listener would hear that that is how you derived the music. And consequently, I became interested much more in harmonic spectra and in whether or not it was possible to work with harmonic spectra to create inharmonic spectra. And so I began to create dissonances, let's say, or non-harmonic spectra by superimposing parts of harmonic spectra and also working on common tones between harmonic spectra. In the case of the next piece I wrote, which was actually 2 or 3 years later, or at least the next piece I completed, it's a piece for originally for 2 violins. I made then a transcription for 2 cellos, and I just want to play a little bit of the opening of that. You will, I think, get the point of this quite quickly. And while it's playing, I just want to assure you that all the sounds you hear are not electronically distorted or something. That's just two cellos playing. There's no ring modulation, for example. Okay, thank you. So what is happening there is that the two lowest strings of the string instruments concerned are being played with very great energy, and you are hearing both the sum and difference tones of those in practical reality. So we hear a C, it's the C and G strings of the cello. We hear a C an octave below, which is of course the difference between the C and G, which would be the second and third harmonics of an overtone of one, an octave lower than the low C string of the cello. And there's also an acoustic fact that the cello is not big enough to resonate its C string properly, and this is one way to get around that fact. Also in writing for string quartet, you can have an imaginary double bass that way. And you can use resonance difference like that in very productive ways. I then became very concerned about mobility, because as you can hear, the pieces I just played are very long tone pieces often, and very slow. And my composition teacher at the time said, does your music always have to live at quarter note equals 35? And I took his point, and in fact I'd always been interested in rhythmic energy. So when I stopped, in fact, for 20 years I used no microtones, although I was still writing using these considerations because of speed. And I became concerned there must be a way of making fast music using non-tempered pitches, and this macrotonality system which I've set up here is one way in which I do that, which is again superimposing fragments of harmonic spectra, assuming the equivalence of intonation, which is not true in acoustic theory, between the 7th, 11th and 13th harmonics, which I approximate all of them to the nearest quarter tone. You know, that isn't acoustically meant to be the case, but, tuba player will know this, that if you actually measure the reality of the intonation of natural harmonics on strings as played as natural harmonics and on brass and so on, very often the 7th harmonic is too flat and often nearer a quarter tone. It's a very tolerable approximation, I find. So if you assume that equivalence, you can make modulations by transforming the 7th harmonic of one spectrum into the 11th harmonic of another one, or in the 13th harmonic of another one, which gives you common tones. In addition, there are many other common tones, of course, possible in the tempered pitches, and that chart shows you very quickly the rules, and also the fact that I band certain intervals because I think they sound detuned normal intervals too much. So the octave is not stretched or compressed by a quarter tone, at the 5th neither, for the same reason, because it has too strong an attraction. And the ear just simply hears an outer tune 5th, at least that is my theory. And also beats are not really a feature of my music. I love Shelsey too much to use beats. So then I want to move on to the next sound example, which is an analysis of the opening of my third string quartet, which I wrote last year for the Jack Quartet, and I will analyze it as it's playing. This is a very oral presentation. So you can see it. Probably I don't have to say so much. Then a short interlude, which is not analysed. Carry on. Oh, sorry, no. Can you play the next sound example? Sorry, thank you very much. That's a number 3. And we go to here. So what is happening is that I'm using these fragments of harmonic spectra to create dissonances, as you see there. There is an inharmonic spectrum, which is the result of four superimposed harmonic spectra, and one is becoming stronger through the passage because the key of the movement, the tonic center of the movement, gradually emerging, making stronger appearances towards the end, is B flat. So the B flat at the top is just having two partials. Then it's having many more, including those two partials. And then it's becoming much lower, and finally you just hear that. And at that point, you are clearly in a sort of B flat. So I am assuming that the simple level consonants have an attraction and a pole to the ear, and that that produces polarity, which I can use also dramatically because I write operas, and that's very useful. In the fourth movement, there are two such fundamentals. There's one fundamental, two such pole pitches. The G string, really, of many string instruments, with the A above it as a sort of pole. And, for example, to see how I create harmony with that, you have, for example, here a superimposition of things that define G, an E-flat spectrum, part of a C spectrum, a G spectrum, with the fundamental will be 2 octaves lower, and an A spectrum, which doesn't, the D spectrum, which includes the A but not the G. So the bias is always towards the G. If we can just play the opening of that movement, please. And I'll show you the score. And this shows that I include noise and different colorations of such centers. I don't disclude that just because I'm also working with pitch center and a sort of tonality. And gradually the attacks are being synchronized. And then they are in sync. And its harmonics. And the resolution back onto the tonic G. Another concern of mine was the fact that I'm going to start making a little comic remark. Too much spectral music seemed to me a hippie movement, which everything was really starry-eyed and wonderful and fantastic and beautiful harmonic series and so on. And there was no minor, or when there was minor, they did it by inverting the harmonic series, which I think is acoustic nonsense. So I decided instead to, sorry, Harry Parch, so I tried instead of oo tonality, to find the minor triad within the harmonic spectrum. And I chose, there are other places you can find a normally tuned minor triad in the harmonic spectrum, but I prefer to have it not normally tuned because I prefer the tuning of this, which is the 6th, 7th, and 9th partials. And if we now play the sound example, thank you very much, we hear a synthetic rendition of that. So that's the perfect 5th B F sharp, and then with the D chord a flat. And then if we play the next sound example, I show how that becomes part of the harmonic spectrum on E, which is actually what it's derived from. So when you are using that triad, you have immediately a polarity between what sounds like the tonic and what isn't the fundamental. Now that is actually inherent in the over 10 series itself, because one thing we should remember about the over 10 series is it is self-reproducing at every level. Every harmonic in the harmonic series has its own overtone series included in the overtone series. and it is reproducing at every partial level. Consequently, by positing a tonic of B within a spectrum of E, that is absolutely legitimate in that sense, if you see acoustically. Now, here is the opening of my third quartet's third movement, which uses this double polarity B-E. It's in a sort of B spectral minor. And you will see and hear that I introduced that very contextually to determine B being the center. And only then and then I use the E as like a dominant of the tonic, a modal dominant. And then I put them together into the B spectrum. There is then a viola sola, which is an improvisation on the lower harmonics of the E spectrum, but still biased towards B. And then we are returning as a refrain to the tonic chord here, but differently spaced, different register, and with a slight more hint of E. And then I transpose the fundamental down 2 octaves to produce a much more grainy, dense version of the same chord here. Thank you. And if we can have the next sound example right away, thank you very much. So,
Go.
yeah. So this is towards the end of the same movement, where I'm landing on this chord, tempered, and I gradually retune it to the B harmonic spectrum, there it is, which leads it back into the B spectral minor. So, using such techniques, one can also use modulations which have something in common with tonal practice, but which are differently oriented because of the timbre question produced by the microtones. And this is going up 2 octaves by harmonics on the strings, with the reprise of the viola sola. And forgive me talking across it, what is happening here is the fundamental is going down 4 octaves lower than that, so it's a very low fundamental, but we are cadencing in B spectral minor. That produces an acoustic result, which you will hear in a sec. The lower down you get, the more intense the beats become between the microtonally tuned pitches. So you get a lot of low difference tones, and especially on the final chord. I don't know how much more time I have. Can somebody tell me?
About 3 minutes.
That's fine. Okay. So where this links up with Schenker is the article that Schenker wrote, Considerations on the Ohrlinie, number 2, which is translated by William Drabkin in the second volume of Schenker Studies. And it's the famous article where he does a very brilliant and completely pointless and superficially pointless critique from his Austro-German stance. We don't need to go into the politics of all that, of the Stravinsky Concerto for Piano and Wind. Now, I urge, if you don't know that, I urge you to read what he says, because it actually is very, very pertinent to how we might hear that piece. In the first place, he says something very interesting. He does, by the way, he takes a progression from the piano part and says, well, so far as I can see, what this should be is this. And he then makes what is clearly the origin of the progression that Stravinsky distorted in the work. And then he says, I don't see any point to those distortions. They seem completely arbitrary. Interesting word. And he says 2 other things that are important. The bars are in order. They're written horizontally in order from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, so I suppose that the composer did intend them to work that way. Well, that's quite an interesting question, actually. And secondly, he says, if it's simply that the composer likes that rhythmic distortion and those dissonances from that fundamental progression, with no logical rhyme or reason behind it, then all the composer is saying to us is, it's this way because I like it this way, and that's enough. And he says it's not enough for a really great piece of music, that it's just the composer liked it that way. And I'm asking the question of myself, is it enough? And I'm also asking that of the listener. But if you are to ask that question, you must have a vocabulary which can generate certain kinds of expectation, and in relation to that, some elements of surprise. And that is also what I'm trying to work with. And if I'm failing, I hope I'm enjoying failing at least. I was also influenced by, and we will have a seminar later with Martin Suckling on Rădulescu, whom I knew, and something he said to me about his string orchestra piece 13 Dreams Ago influenced also this piece very much, which is the question of how much you explain to the listener when you have the work, how much the work explains its origins. And I pointed out at one point in the piece, which is all derived from an E harmonic spectrum in many different ways, that at one point the double bass comes in with the E. By the way, the piece makes interesting comparison with Partiels from 3 years before by Grisey, so it's an interesting coincidence. And he said, yes, he said, I give some hints only. And for me in this piece, the question was, how explicit do you make the tonic or not? Or do you just give hints? Can the listener find a way through the sonic labyrinth or not? What is the probability, the weighting of a pitch or not? And with such considerations, I'm trying to generate ways in which structure can work with expectation, repetition, time, and change. And I don't have time to play my last sound example, which is the last 3 minutes of the quartet. But I'll wrap up then and give us time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Questions?
Well, thank you for that. It's very, very inspiring talk with the music. I just wanted to say that it's not a question so much as a personal observation that,
yes,
for me, I thought that you set up brilliantly the parameter register, octave register, as a potential point of doing what you're talking about doing. Because, in fact, the spectra don't, on acoustic instruments, they're not going to replicate exactly in every octave, and so there are these slight differences. And so when we heard the motivic transpositions, they're not actually octave transpositions, literal.
No, they can't be because of the way spectral work. Yeah.
Well, because of psycho-acoustics. So I found that fascinating, just to hear the same thing and replicated in different octaves.
If I may answer the question that is behind what you're saying, perhaps, I don't really believe in the notion of inharmonic spectra, and that's also something I owe to Rădulescu, who always said to me, they don't exist. He said, if they're there basically, there is some low fundamentals you don't hear. And I don't know whether that's, as it were, true or not, but it's something I found interesting to work with, and that's why, for example, if you look superficially at the last chord on that page, that would said to be a classic inharmonic spectrum, rather bell-like actually. It's quite close to the bell of Harvey's Morto Splango. But it's you can hear also, if you hear, I hope it was loud, I think it was loud enough, a very deep fundamental E is implied, and you hear it sort of vibrating. So I think there's a lot of ambiguity there. And of course, one of the great things about spectral music, which makes it very, I think this may be why musicology took a long time to catch up with, it really relishes ambiguity. I think real spectralists don't want clean, nice answers. And that's one of the reasons also why I don't want to limit my sound palette to any one area. I like having the possibility to have very diatonic and consonant formations and the exact opposite and many grades in between. And I think that's something that this movement has opened up in a different way from, although parallel from minimalism. But the thing about minimalism, it generally excludes the noise end, you see. Doesn't sell.
Take one more question.
Yeah. Oh. All right. Thank you. You just used the word bell-like, What does that mean?
So I was drawing a parallel between the final spectrum or chord, whatever we're going to call it, of that movement that I played, and the bell spectrum that is used, which is the bell of Winchester Cathedral, which is recorded and analyzed, used, and decomposed all throughout Mortuus Plango Vivus Voca by Jonathan Harvey. It has a very similar formation, and if I may get up and just explain that. The classic formation of a bell spectrum is that you would have a minor tenth at the bottom, and then a compound fourth above the low ring note. Okay. Now, by the way, in Harvey's analysis of Mortuus Plango, he says that that note, which is an F in his piece, isn't existing, that it's not in the spectrum, it's a different tone of higher harmonics, which approximate to that. In point of fact, that isn't true. Martin Suckling and I once filtered that spectrum with audio sculpt or Spear, actually, and that F is in the spectrum, by the way, Jonathan. Sorry, no longer here to say it. So that's what I meant, okay, by that definition of a very simple definition of the way church bells often are built to resonate. So if you go to the factories, they can explain to you exactly how they build the bell in order to produce those precise frequencies. They have very precise terms for them.
Thank you.
One more question.
We need to wrap up there.
A million.
Okay. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you.